California's Super Tuesday primary is on our doorstep. It's decision day on presidential candidates, congressional races, the San Diego mayor's contest, ballot initiatives, and much more. We'll take a last look at the big issues and races. I'm Mark Sauer, and the KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, David Garrick, who covers City Hall for the San Diego Union-Tribune, KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma, columnist Michael Smolens, also of the Union-Tribune, and freelance journalist Seth Coombs. Eureka! California is a political afterthought no longer. The nation's largest state will be among the earliest to vote in the presidential primary, joining 14 other states, one territory, and something called Democrats Abroad on Super Tuesday. More than a third of all delegates to the Democratic National Convention will be awarded in Tuesday's vote, with 30% of those coming from California alone. But it's going to take a while to learn the detailed results, even without an Iowa-style screw-up. And Michael, California's moved it up before. What happened then?
Well, California was on Super Tuesday back, I believe, in 2004. John Kerry won the nomination, but it was different. He was pretty much the guy that was going to win coming in. It's different now because we really, it's really open season, although Bernie Sanders is the odds-on favorite to come out of Super Tuesday with a very good lead, if not an insurmountable lead. In 2000, California also moved it up to March, but again, Al Gore came in as the presumptive favorite by then and sort of cleaned up. So it didn't really work to have that kind of impact that they're looking for. California will definitely have an impact on this election.
All right, I'll throw it out to Seth, and Michael jump in, but it's complicated.
I may need some help, yeah.
It's complicated to say the least how these are awarded, and it's weighted by district, and there's at large, and there's congressional districts. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember here is that people are, yes, they are casting their vote for a candidate, but what they're really casting their vote for is delegates, for their candidate to get delegates to the convention in hopes that they will be the eventual nominee at that convention. Now, California has, I believe, 490 plus delegates. Of that, 271 are apportioned to these, basically like these district elections.
Like primaries within the state primary.
Yeah, they're like elections within, it's like an election within election, and essentially what you're having is a 53 local district elections to choose delegates in order to get your nominee into the presidential race.
Hey, Michael, are we going to know everything on Tuesday night, or is the dust has to settle?
One other aspect of that is that there's a threshold that to get delegates, there's a statewide delegates, and then there's in the individual 53 congressional districts. You have to get 15% of the vote statewide at least, and 15% of the vote in each of those districts to get delegates. The most recent poll had Bernie Sanders statewide at 34%, I believe, and Elizabeth Warren at 17. Everybody else was below 15. So if those stats hold up, those would be the only two to get statewide delegates. And then the polls further showed down how it drilled down into the congressional districts. So it is complicated. It's made up to make campaigns really, spread their worth around.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting because Sanders has like 20 field offices in California. Nobody's got anywhere near that much. Daddy Warbucks, Mike Bloomberg, has 11, and of course he's been spending millions and millions of dollars on TV.
It's not inconceivable because of that 15% rule that there could be some districts where they don't get that amount of votes, especially because the field is so much more crowded this year as the years past that you mentioned.
So
I don't think a lot of voters know about this, and I think it's going to be a huge disappointment to them, especially people who support Buttigieg or Bloomberg.
So I'm Biden or a Biden supporter. I get 14.5%, and my votes are just wiped out. I get no delegates, right?
Well, you don't get initially any delegates. Basically, like you don't get it. You don't get the majority. You don't get the all of them. Mm-hmm. So I think the rule is that if you don't get 15%, it's then apportioned. It's like by percentage points, and you get a certain amount of delegates based on your percentage. Is that
no? If you don't get 15%,
they take the votes.
But don't those delegates get reapportioned to the people who are lower in the?
If in the 49th congressional district, if only Bernie Sanders gets above 15%, he gets the delegates.
Right.
That's
all
correct.
the delegates in that.
Yeah.
Well, Amitha, I think you said it there. There's going to be a lot of people post-election who's going to wake up and realize a lot of these details.
And if they realize it now, it may dissuade them from voting.
Right.
You know, I mean, if
It
you
sounds
are
like they
a
don't,
Buttigieg
since
reporter,
we don't even get it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
a little bit of it.
I know. I've read 2 or 3 of these analyses 2 or 3 times, and it's tough to figure this out.
It's not entirely new that I think Democrats certainly understand they're not winner-take-all states. The Republicans have more of a winner-take-all system, and not entirely, but so they understand that there's different thresholds. Do they get into the weeds on this? I think, frankly, Democrats are going to be very energized on Tuesday. I mean, they've got a hotly contested election in California for the first time in a long time. I would be surprised if turnout wasn't pretty good.
No, and I get the feeling folks are excited that we're actually part of it at this point in time, because even though you pointed out in 2000 and 2004 it was sort of not that important, there's been a lot of years where I feel like Californians wish we were part of it at this point, instead of waiting till June when it's already going to be decided. 3 months, a big difference. 3 months is a big difference.
What are we hearing about the turnout? Because it affects not, of course, just what we're talking about, the presidential nomination race on the Democratic side, but the mayor's race, the congressional turnouts, the ballot measures, which we'll get to a lot of that. Going to be a lot of turnout?
I think there's some optimism about that, and it's great to point out the mayor's race, because I think it looks like Todd Gloria, based on polling, seems almost for sure to be among the top 2 that heads to November runoff, and Barbara Bree and Scott Sherman are fighting for the 2nd spot. And Sherman is a Republican and Bree is a Democrat. So if there's huge turnout among Democrats who are excited about the primary, that seems like it would really help Bree and give her a better chance to make that top 2 slot.
So wind up with 2 Democrats, and that's what that jungle primary we've talked about can do.
And actually, some local Republican leaders were a little concerned about that. They're looking forward to November because, unlike 2018, which the turnout among Republicans was not very good, Trump may not be popular in California, but he's very popular among Republicans, and they expect Republicans to turn out much better in this November than they did in November 2018.
Then Democratic turnout would be...
But Democratic turnout will be good. But my point, getting a long way to get there, is that on Tuesday there might not be as much for Republicans to get out, and because we have top 2 primaries, in certain races in heavily Democratic districts, they're concerned that a Republican might not get through to November.
I think that they could turn out. I mean, as far as what data has shown us from the past,
they being Republicans.
Yeah, they being Republicans. What data has shown us in the past is that the older conservative voters do come out for the primaries, and they know who their presidential nominee is going to be. Obviously, but I think that they would be much more inclined to vote like somebody like Scott Sherman, who could squeak in.
And especially if the voters in the 50th congressional district who may want to maintain that as a Republican seat, and the voters in the 49th congressional district who may want to flip that. They're going to be out there in droves if they're highly motivated.
I agree with you, but I think nothing gets people excited more than a presidential primary. I mean, that's the big thing. And if Trump were facing opposition, or if the Republican ticket was not known, I think you would get higher turnout than you're going to get now, for sure. The question is, by what margin will the difference be?
Well, and when they did the change to the top 2 primary, there was a lot of talk about how that there could be a lot of cases where you'd have 2 candidates from one party advancing. That's still pretty rare. I mean, it happens, but not as often. It usually happens in a very Republican or very Democratic district, and there are lots of those. But even in those, you mentioned the 50th, which is a very Republican district. The one lone Democrat, Amar Kampa-Najjar, is almost certainly going to get through to November.
Now, it's tough in a state as big as California, Texas. These Super Tuesdays, just so many states to even campaign. They got bombarded in Iowa and New Hampshire and these smaller states, but you just can't cover it all if you're a candidate, no matter how much money you got.
Well, and we will see what happens on Tuesday. In some cases, candidates that sort of come out of nowhere, like Mayor Pete Buttigieg, can kind of build. But with the big states like California coming so soon, it's hard to ramp up to that. Iowa and New Hampshire are just an entirely different world. You look at Bernie Sanders, who's working off his 2016 race. He's had infrastructure there and been building for 4 years. The other sort of extreme end of that spectrum of being ramped up is Mike Bloomberg, who basically has a several $100 million pop-up campaign that
I mean, every time you watch something on YouTube, you are just inundated with Bloomberg. It's like blanket,
He's everywhere, All right, let's move on. We touched on the mayor's race after years of Republicans in the San Diego mayor's office, despite a brief interruption. A Democrat figures to take over in 2020. Oddly, the main contest may just be for second place. Todd Gloria, former council member, current state legislator Barbara Bree, current council member, are the main Democratic contenders, with Gloria seemingly in the lead, as you noted. Republican Scott Sherman turned out, council members, the chief Republican challenger. Top 2 vote getters move on to November. So you touched on this. The jungle primary could end up with 2 Democrats. Huh?
It could. I mean, especially like I said, there's a strong turnout among Democratic voters. Most polling I've seen, Sherman is slightly ahead of Bree, but they're within the margin of error. So I think it's really going to be touch and go which one of them comes out. One thing I'd point out is a lot of those polls are before Bree started kind of an advertising blitz, or maybe that's overstating it, but more TV advertising. So that may have helped her, especially when it was a small margin. But we're going to see if that'll be one of the interesting things to watch on Tuesday night is which of those 2, Bree or Sherman, makes the runoff with Gloria.
And Michael, how nuanced does this all get? I mean, you've done some columns on this race, and other races we'll talk about have gotten testy. Labor is for, labor is against certain candidates.
True. Well, I fall into this, all the time, but I think we make too much out of the partisan aspect of municipal races. I mean, it's a heavily Democratic city. We have a Republican mayor, so obviously he attracted some Democrats or Democratic-leaning independents.
Where do they go now?
Well, I mean, where do they go? They've got plenty of choices. They've got, Barbara Bree, a business-oriented candidate who's kind of wants restrictions on development. Todd Gloria, who really has an amazing coalition when you think about it. I mean, he's got Labor, he's got the Chamber of Commerce, the Democratic Party. As David said, he's sort of in the catbird seat on this. But Scott Sherman's going to attract some conservatives because he's kind of the Republican aspect. But I just think in a lot of cases, municipal issues, I'm not saying partisanship doesn't matter, but I don't think it's as strong of a driver as in the congressional races because, literally people don't have the DNRs after their name.
But I think one thing I would say, a counter argument to that, is the last time that it was in November, Filner did win, right? And then Faulkner won in a special election in February.
Filner, the Democrat, we should
right?
know.
And so I'm saying Faulkner, the Republican, won it.
Right.
So I'm not disputing that, but I'm saying the last time we did have one that went to November, the Democrat did win.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
And I do wonder how strong of a sense there is among voters about wanting that contrast at the municipal level of a Republican versus a Democrat. I don't know if that's a real thing, but it doesn't seem like there is a ton to differentiate Barbara Bree from Todd Gloria, but maybe there is.
I slightly disagree. I think that, and I think Michael will agree with me, that Bree has sort of pivoted to a more sort of centrist candidate, whereas...
Well, that's exactly what happened, because I used to cover it, and 2 years ago, they were the same on every issue.
Right.
And I think only after they became mayoral candidates did she feel the need to separate herself because she can't stand the same as him.
Gimmicky. It comes across as gimmicky when you're doing that. So for voters who are paying attention, maybe they're not buying that differentiation.
I do think, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think maybe she was forced to do that, but I also think that there are some real issues, and I think one of the things that she's focused on, and Sherman maybe as well, is that while Michael pointed out that Todd has a remarkable coalition, and Todd says that proves that everyone supports him, I think there are folks who are suspicious of how can everyone support this guy. And, Barbara has made the case that maybe people just like business as usual. Maybe the labor unions and business interests want a certain setup at City Hall that they know how to work, they know how to maneuver, and that Barbara maybe would bring real change. And when you look at the Ash Street controversy, when you look at the hepatitis crisis, maybe a shakeup is what's needed. And I think that's what Barbara's trying to sell, is that she would be more likely to shake things up than Todd.
And I do think there's something to be said for the fact that Scott Sherman has just sort of laid back in the cut and just let these 2 Democrats tear each other apart. And he's a relatively soft-spoken guy as is.
Yeah, well, laid back. He didn't even enter till Thanksgiving. So, they gave them a long time to attack each other, and now he's sort of jumped in and he's fresh, and no one's really attacking him, I don't think, because he doesn't seem to be a favorite.
No, and that could be to his benefit.
Let's talk a little bit about, and we'll do this more as the year goes on, well after this primary, but Mayor Kevin Faulkner, as we know, moderate Republican here, his legacy, it's a legacy issue, Michael, on the ballot this time with this convention center, and this is kind of the last go-round, is it not?
Well, certainly one of them. He's been pushing a convention center expansion even since before he was mayor, when he was on the city council. It's been gone in fits and starts, so finally, at least they're getting it on the ballot, and we'll see what happens. We've mentioned all the time it's a 2/3 vote, and that's a very difficult achievement. As I've mentioned,
there's been opposition, which was maybe unexpected, but there's been more opposition, I think, than they thought they would have.
Interestingly, because what seems to be the most controversial is the convention center expansion, but it's a prominent homeless advocate, because as we know, the Prop C would raise hotel taxes for the expansion of the convention center, homeless programs, and road repairs. Michael McConnell, the homeless advocate, just thinks that there's a lot of loopholes and so forth. So it doesn't take much to knock things down. But getting back to your original question, it would be a big hit on Faulkner not to win this one. There's other things. How does he do on housing and homelessness? Those are the things he's really focusing on. They've made, a lot of statements and a lot of policies. It's still unclear how much progress they've made. The building permits haven't been to the degree that they say they need. We'll see what the next homeless count is. San Diego's he's gotten a lot of attention for progress here when it's skyrocketed elsewhere, but other people are sort of suspicious as to how real that is.
Right.
I think when you look at it long term, though, I just have to say covering City Hall, maybe success is the only barometer you should use, but the amount of effort they've made on housing has been truly comprehensive and remarkable from my perspective. They've addressed granny flats, live workspaces, middle income density bonuses, low income density bonuses. I mean, they've really run the gamut. I don't think anyone really could have tried any harder, but they're not succeeding, so I guess that's what ends up being, the barometer.
Well, it takes a while, let's face that, but despite all that, is it putting up enough units to change the market and make housing more affordable?
And the same
that's
conversation is happening statewide. Governor Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, and to your point, I've never seen a local measure be, attacked from sort of both sides, seemingly both sides, whereas you have these anti-tax conservative
And it's taxes
folks,
on tourists. We got
right,
it's
but
not
it's
the folks
no
here.
taxes,
Yeah.
no taxes. So it's always for them that's always their position, and then for again somebody like homeless advocates like Michael McConnell, they're saying no, this isn't what is needed, and you're basically just doing this to get this convention center that you've always wanted.
Well, I think everyone agrees that we should raise the hotel tax. Of the tourist-friendly cities in the country, we have among the lowest. The question is, what should we do with that money, and is this the right thing to do with that money?
Right, you got the one shot to do that,
Right.
and you got the one pool of money to take in on it. Other measures here besides the convention center expansion? We've got B, that's another one.
Well, that's the Newland Sierra project, about 2,000 homes, give or take, just north of Escondido, right off I-15.
Kind of symbolic in its own sense.
It is. It became controversial because, according to the county general plan, that kind of development wasn't supposed to be there, but the county supervisors approved a general plan amendment that riled people up there, and they got the signatures for a referendum. So it's a bit of a watershed aspect to it, but it gets confusing because there's another even broader development initiative, Measure A, as we've talked about before, that would require any kind of general plan amendment like that to go to a county-wide vote, which is a big deal. So really,
It's a big deal because it would slow down development and it would scare developers off
Right.
because of the hassle of having to go to the
Right.
voters.
Right.
Right?
Or as the advocates would say, no, it would focus development where it should be along the transit corridors, and you could build density, which brings lower income housing. Anyway, those are the sort of the basic arguments, but I think the bottom line is that those two initiatives combined could really shape the future of how San Diego is going to grow for decades to come.
Amitha?
I'm super curious. Without the opposition from the Golden Door Spa, how strong would the opposition be against Measure B?
It would be very strong and vocal, but it wouldn't have the financing. I mean, very simply put, they're really the key, opponents to that, and they may push it over the edge. But having said that, I think that you can't underestimate the anti-development, gene in San Diego's DNA. I'm sure that's a hackneyed way of putting it. Throughout its history, there's always been that push-pull, and anti-development sentiment is always pretty strong.
There
at
are
this time.
various environmental groups who are pretty,
Right.
have been pretty outspoken against it as well.
financing issue.
All right, we're going to continue our freewheeling and move on to the Congress races. Even more to talk about. We've talked a lot about the very red 50th congressional district and the contest between Republicans Darrell Issa, Carl DeMaio, as well as Democrat Amar Kampa-Najjar, who's on his second go-round. But the safe Democratic 53rd being vacated by the retirement of Susan Davis after 20 years has really heated up. And Seth, a fairly large number of candidates, but we're going to go to the three Democrats here, given our limited time today. Thumbnails: Sarah Jacobs, Georgette Gomez, Janessa Goldbeck.
Yeah, sure. So Georgette Gomez obviously is the first. She's a community organizer. She was the first LGBTQ Latino woman to be elected to the city council. Became council president. Janessa Goldbeck is a former Marine victims' rights advocate, and Sarah Jacobs is a anti-poverty nonprofit, and also worked in the Obama administration, correct?
Well, she was a contractor. There's a lot
Yeah.
of contractors.
I don't want to say that.
Everybody wants to say they work in the Obama administration.
Right.
I spent a bunch of time
I was in D.C. once. But anyway.
this winter trying to figure out who really worked for the Obama administration or who answered mail for Obama in the basement. Which maybe counts, but not
But I think
traditionally.
the big thing about Sarah Jacobs is her grandfather
Yes.
is Irwin
Right.
Jacobs.
And a big supporter of KPBS, we should know.
Co-founder of Qualcomm, and she's very wealthy, and that shows in her campaign. Although she's done a heck of a job fundraising. It's not just like she's self-funding, but that I think is related to the fact that her grandfather has been a huge Democratic
like 9 million,
donor over the
But
decades.
It's interesting. Can we ever mention Sarah Jacobs without including the fact that
know.
she's the granddaughter?
That's why I didn't mention it.
It's not in this
But she
context,
knows
but-
that when she gets
No.
there.
I mean, I'm not.
yeah.
I'm not knocking you for bringing it up.
No,
But the three women candidates who it looks like it's going to come down to.
Right.
It'll be two.
But
Go ahead.
I'll
Go
dissent
ahead.
on that. The one Republican who's not campaigning, Chris Stoddard, who's a reservist, and he ended up a distant second in the poll we did. Now, that was before a lot of what Georgette Gomez was doing and Janessa Goldbeck, but a distant second behind Sarah Jacobs. And some weird stuff is going on. Sarah Jacobs ran an ad that just sort of portrays him as the lone opponent, as the Trump Republican. And in a way, in a backhanded way, that's an effort to boost his candidacy. I mean, what she wants to do is
Squeeze out the Democrats.
Yeah, have him
To guarantee yourself a win in
Like, yeah,
November.
and
like-
there's also been an independent mailer that is just like a positive mailer to this guy about this guy.
Right.
So-
It's like, yeah,
Old
so-
tactic.
But he has an R next to his name, so he's going to get a chunk, and it's just
yeah,
a primary.
but
Just
it
get
certainly
through.
helps to have some money that he doesn't know who's doing the independent campaign.
Yeah, to Michael's point, let's be clear. This seat in November is not flipping red or
No,
anything
no.
like that. The idea is that you want to get a Republican on the ticket. If,
You win the
if
primary
you're Sarah,
as a Democrat,
If you're
you've
Sarah
won the
Jacobs,
seat.
you want to run against a Republican.
yeah.
And the idea is that if you sort of like grease the wheels a bit on this Chris Stoddard's campaign, then he might end up on the ballot with you, in which case it's easy sailing from then on.
And do we have any ethical problems with her doing that? I mean, is it all fair and love in war and elections, or is that
Well,
really?
Georgette Gomez certainly, she filed an FEC complaint. Well, actually, she mentioned Jacobs, but it's more the independent committee. There wasn't any. You don't know who it is. There's no disclaimer or identification as required.
Is that
by
because
law.
Citizens United, they don't have to reveal it, or what?
No,
why would
it's required by the FEC.
So they just haven't done it.
and they didn't do it.
Yeah, it's like at this point the damage is
But-
done.
But this is a tried and true tactic. I mean, Newsom did it when he was running against Villaraigosa, and he
Ray
ended
Davis did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about a little bit, when our time's limited, on Janessa Goldbeck, who's kind of come out of nowhere. We talked about Jacobs and the funding there, Gomez with the name recognition and with the council and all. But Goldbeck's really just come up with a grassroots campaign.
Well, that, and I think the more people listen to her and pay attention to her and look at her background, the more impressed they are with her.
The UT endorsed her. Tell me
Right.
about that. You could
Well,
have knocked me over with a feather when I saw that.
Just for the record, I'm a columnist and I'm not part of the editorial board.
I'm
But
also
that,
not.
That was,
Right.
yeah, that was
Firewall,
But
yeah.
that was a surprise, I think, just for the basic reasons I'm saying that they interviewed the top candidates and had a lot of nice things to say about them, but just thought she rose above, I think, primarily, certainly her service as a captain in the Marines, but also she was a humanitarian activist. She worked to help avoid atrocities in Darfur. She was doing a lot of lobbying on those issues in Washington. So I think that the editorial board thought that she had a good deal of Washington experience that the others didn't. And Georgette Gomez has certain skill sets and experiences, but she hasn't done that in Washington.
And looking behind the curtain, like the UT editorial board has been sort of endorsing a lot more centrist candidates, and I think Janessa is more of
That could be part of it.
David?
I also feel like I think in some cities the newspaper tries to endorse someone who they think is a good candidate and who they think could win.
Yeah.
And I think our editorial board, at least in recent years, has been more willing to endorse candidates. Maybe it's the best candidate, and we're not really care if they have a chance to win.
Sure.
Use the city council in District 9. They endorsed a candidate who most people feel has almost no chance to win, but they were impressed by him in the interviews and decided to
And
And
they
I
vote.
think
talked to
that's
them all in the
exactly what
interviews,
happened
yeah.
here with Goldbeck. She could articulate her positions on big issues like healthcare, whereas perhaps the others weren't as eloquent as she was.
And Janessa Goldbeck, I mean, she's been out to all these forums. All the candidates have, but you got to make your impressions with the groups in coffees and living rooms and at
This is my
debates and
this
forums.
is my district. Janessa Goldbeck is a very appealing candidate.
And you're not alone. Mia Farrow endorsed her.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right,
I don't know how much that's worth, but
Nothing.
Create a little buzz.
we got about a minute left. Let's go to the 50th out there. The race to replace Duncan Hunter. You got two Republicans butting heads. Campa-Najjar, the Democrats, seems to have a shoe into November. Would you think, Michael?
I think that, even when Darrell Issa first announced in September, he said it's going to be one of us and Amar Campa-Najjar. I mean, let's face it, he almost defeated Duncan Hunter, who we know, has left office because of his legal problems.
Nobody under indictment this time around. Though.
Yeah, no, that's
Not
true.
yet.
It's a different ballgame, but you're not going to see two Republicans advance. Once the Republican gets into November, I think it's going to be very tough for a competent
So
justice.
Isa DeMaio?
So, but then,
Who knows?
but then
Aletha?
how have enough hearts and minds been changed in that district to flip some Republicans to actually vote for a Democrat going into the general?
Oh, I think in some cases, and that was probably the case, in 2018, although there was a different Republican, standard bearer. But I still think that everybody that sort of looked at this, you might get some crossovers, but
What's the
possibly not
registration
enough.
advantage? 2 to 1, 3 to 1?
Yeah, it's red.
Yeah.
All right, got to cut it off there. More next week, more to come. It's a great discussion today. Thank you. That does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, David Garrick of the San Diego Union Tribune, Amitha Sharma of KPBS News, Michael Smolens, also of the Union Tribune, and freelance journalist Seth Coombs. Well, be sure to vote on Tuesday and listen to our updates on KPBS Radio beginning at 8 p.m. and watch complete coverage on KPBS TV at 10. In the meantime, check out our comprehensive election guide at kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and be sure and join us again next week for our postmortem on the Roundtable.